Okay, so this is a quick tutorial on Out of the Park 21, just starting a franchise. I've been doing an Orioles sim that I've been posting videos on. I've got some questions from people about specific things, but also just general, like, how, tips for starting the game, people who want to get in the game. So this isn't going to be too in-depth. This is just going to be some basic settings and some basic, like, strategy things that I do when I first start. And here, this is at the home screen where I've started a new standard game. I've picked the leagues I want to do, put in information here, and you pick a team. So you want to first pick if you want to be the GM or manager. I would recommend, if you haven't played the game before, doing one or the other, just because the game's a lot to learn. I enjoy general manager mode a lot more. Commissioner mode, I mean, it lets you kind of play God for the league. I don't do it. Cannot be fired. The only time I'd really recommend doing that is if you are in if you want to do something kind of fun, or if you're with a team who's rebuilding and you kind of want the patience of an owner who might not normally have it. Maybe that's okay to do. I'm going to check it here just because I'm going to use this save to do different stuff for videos, just like tutorials of things people have asked about. But here, I generally play with the O's and GM, so I'm just going to start with them here. And again, I don't normally do the cannot be fired, but we're going to do it here. So then it takes you to the homepage. And one thing I'll say before I start is the Out of the Park manual on their website is actually great. This is a super in-depth game. I've played it for years, and I still learn things or still different things I'm not sure about, that I kind of play around with, and it takes a long time to learn this game, but the manual is great. So this is just going to be basic, I want to get started and just get a feel for it kind of thing, which I think your first franchise will probably be. My first one that I started, I don't know if it was on Out of the Park 12 or 13. I got a year or two in, and I was like, man, I know so much more now, so I started over. So I would say just plan on your first thing being a learning experience. First thing you want to do is go, you can do it in whatever order, but one first thing to do is go into your manager settings and decide what you want to control. You can have your manager or your minor league managers or your assistant GM do as much or as little as you want. I generally, like I said, I leave the settings just like this. I obviously want to do the free agency and the trades and the draft and all that and set budgets. Minor league personnel, I like to do because I have certain things that I like for those guys. And minor league promotions, demotion strategy. Some people think that's a little tedious to do. I like to manage every player of my organization, and I go through the whole organization about once a month and promote guys. And then I do a big thing at the end of the year where I promote, demote, and release guys. So that's one thing you're definitely going to want to look at. And then here, if we go to the game settings, you don't want to look at player rating scales. You can do a bunch of different things. I prefer the 20 to 80 for rating, and we'll look at player ratings and what that means. But this is basically just how players are evaluated. I prefer the 20 to 80 scale. If you don't know what that is, you can do a 1 to 10 scale, 1 to 20. 1 to 5, any of that. But baseball scouting, it generally uses a 20 to 80, so I like that. And I do the overall rating with that too. Just because, if you read a set like Fangraphs, they've got future value. They often speak about in players' value, and I'm used to that, so I use it. You can use whatever you want. I prefer that just because it is much more baseball type logo or lingo, I guess. There are a bunch of settings you can mess around with. Again, these are just the basics I recommend getting started with. Trade difficulty, I recommend starting here, but then I do very hard and favor prospects, heavily favors prospects, because I found that especially when you're trying to rebuild, it just makes it a bit more challenging, because you can sometimes, with as smart and as good as this game is, you can still sometimes exploit the AI. Player evaluation AI settings is one I'd recommend getting to after you have a feel for the game. I've tried some different ways. I don't think this way is bad. I think it's fine, especially if you're just starting. So then another thing I'd check is the league setting options. And I would, just make sure that these rules are what you want. They're all set to the major league ones, but maybe you want the NL to have a DH, whatever. You don't like the minimum 3 batter face rule going on. So I would definitely look into, I'd probably leave that alone for now if I'm just starting, but this is just kind of an overview of things you can do. One thing you might want to look at is, do you want to enable automatic evolution in the league? And that all these things can kind of change throughout. This expansion can happen, a team can relocate. Do you want this to happen or not? Or you can kind of force it to happen at times. You want to turn it off. You don't want to let the computer mess with these things. You can force it to happen. You can always undo it after it happens. So those are kind of the first settings I'd recommend looking at. Again, there are a million things you can look at here, but if you're just getting started, I recommend looking at that. One of the first things I do when you start the game, you're just prior to opening day, and you have some budgets that you can adjust before opening day. During every season after this, it'll be open from the end of the season until the beginning of spring training, these budgets. Once spring training starts, or in the first season, once opening day comes, these are set. So you want to get them set to what you want. Right now, if I'm running the Orioles, when I did this, I unloaded some salary before this budget set for the year, so I could bump these up. Some people will tell you that the player development budget, it's zeroed out, it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't do that, and perhaps kind of anecdotally, in the 10 15 franchises I've done, I've found a difference in how players develop when I crank the player development budget up as high as I can. I think it's one of the more important things to consider when you're starting. Some people disagree with that, but I certainly really pay attention to it. Draft budget, you're going to want to look at this recommended draft slot amounts. This is based off of the picks that you have, what they recommend. You're going to want to go over this if you can in this year's version. They've really changed the way slots go, and some players will ask for $15-18 million if you draft them in the top of the draft. So I'd say get that as high as you can. An international free agent, if you can, always get it to $5 million so you can max out. If there's a superstar player, it's going to take $5 million to sign him. Or superstar prospect, I guess I should say. It's going to take $5 million to sign him. Bump these up if you can. So one thing that I'd say is super duper important is your scout. Your staff in general is important, and that's a whole different topic of what kind of staff you look for, etc. I wouldn't recommend firing anybody right now. Like, let them run out their contract unless things really just aren't working. Because a lot of these guys are only signed for 1 year. So let them be in this year and then get guys in that you want after that. Don't waste the money on firing them and still paying them and then paying somebody else just in the first year. But all that goes except for the scout. Your scout is so important in this game. If you have scouting enabled. If you don't have scouting enabled, ignore this. But I love playing with scouting enabled. I wouldn't want to play it any other way. Now, why is scouting important? So let's just go to like a random player. Let's look at Austin Hayes. So if you look at his ratings here, this is what my head scout thinks of him. This is my head scout's rating. And you also have the OSA, which is kind of like the head scouting agency for the league's rating. There is no set player rating in this game that you can have access to unless you go into commissioner mode and you look at the player's profile, etc., and kind of cheat. It's not like Madden where a player is a 90 and he's a 90, or the show or whatever. You have to rely on your scout heavily to know how good guys are. Of course, it's just like real life. You also want to pay attention to real stats, but you're not going to have a set number that works. So I would go in and find the scout that most suits what you want. Don't pay attention to this reputation here. What you're going to want to look at is his different scouting ratings. So if in this instance I'm the Orioles, I'm rebuilding, I'm going to want amateur draft is the first thing I'm going to want. I'm going to want a guy who's great at that. And this guy's fine, but I'm sure there's somebody out there better. So I'm going to go in here, to the personnel page, and I'm going to look at scout. And then I'm just going to look at scouting by amateurs. See, here are some guys that are, and I like highly favors tools because you get guys with a higher ceiling. Scouts who favor ability, you might have less big misses on players, but you're not going to get the real as high ceiling guys favored by your scout. So a bunch of outstanding guys here, and then 2 guys who have excellent and excellent. So basically, bar and tools are pretty much the same, except bar is better at international, whereas bridge is better at minor leagues. There's a lot more minor leaguers to scout. International play has, with the way it's default to set up in this, has fewer players to evaluate. So I would go with Bridges. I would sign him. Let's see if it'll even let me with what like my budget is right now. Yeah. So what? And you can always go a little lower, like whatever, go 20,000. Sure, it's only $30,000, but if you do it with 15 different employees, like it can add up. So and he'd probably sign for 3 years, but so I would just go in and submit that offer him to get the scout that I really want. That is so so important. So and then a couple other things that I would do if I'm just starting. If you're going to control all of your minor leagues, promotions, demotions, etc., I would recommend getting a feel for it, and kind of looking at each level. Do I have enough guys? So they have 25 guys here. Okay. I like to keep really about 35, fewer than 40, probably about 18 pitchers and 18 hitters at each level, which sounds insane. But especially at AAA, because I'm going to be rotating pitchers up and down to the minors, to the majors. But I want depth, for when guys get hurt, etc. And I just want depth so I can kind of let that go a little bit and not manage it day to day. So of course I want to make sure like my top prospects aren't getting blocked out by having too many guys, but I'll sign some depth guys, just to make sure I have a few extra guys at each position. So I would recommend going through each team, which you can do through this rosters and transaction page, or now you can be like, let's see what's going in Bowie and the lineup and check it out and get a feel for your guys. And one thing I'd recommend doing is, I have Rutschman at first base. One thing I'd recommend doing is figuring out who your top prospects are and decide if you want to develop them specifically at the position they're at or another position. So like Ryan McKenna. Looks like he could be a decent hitting prospect, and he's got really good defensive ratings, and he might be able to become a better center fielder. He could definitely become better at left field and right field. So how do you do that? You go into action, set game strategy, and then you want to force start him at center field. So that is going to help him work up his center field rating quicker. And with and I would recommend making players versatile too. I'd give McKenna some time at center field, but then I'd also give him a month or two at left field and right field, and continue to do that when he's at AAA too, because he could probably be a really good corner outfielder and a solid center fielder with these defensive ratings. So I think that's a really important thing to do when you start, is identify, these are the guys I want to develop at these positions, get them really high at certain positions that you feel like they'll best be suited at or you need them most at, and then get them versatile around where they can play. You can also figure out where guys might have more of his versatility going into their ratings page, and see he's got his infield range is okay, his error is okay, his arm is pretty good, turn double play is terrible. He can't be an infielder. I don't know, maybe a first baseman, but who cares? So you'll find guys that don't have any position ratings for infield, but they might be able to develop into a decent infielder. So you want to check that out. Developing good fielding is so important. Before you start your sim, if you're controlling your minor leagues, go in and force start your important guys at certain positions so that they become better. It'll be a huge asset to you. So that's kind of how I would set it up. And then, roster strategy, all those things, are all episodes in and of themselves. These are kind of things in terms of settings and then strategies that I'd recommend starting with before you kind of just, really begin to nerd out on the game, which you'll do for hours and hours and hours. Figure out your settings, get your scout together, and then figure out a plan for your minor leaguers and what you want to do with them position-wise. And then dig into your just overall strategy of what you want to do with your roster this year. And I'll certainly get into other things like that, like, how to dump a salary, how to identify the best package you can get if you're trying to deal off an asset, etc. I'll get into that. But these are just a few tips that I've generally have found myself telling people a lot when they say, how do I start this game? So there it is. Maybe. Yeah.